1:14 a.m. Gulf Standard Time. There was no incoming launch. No SBIRS alert. No radar track climbing above a ridgeline. The night sky over the Persian Gulf was clear and empty, and the carrier group operating 210 nautical miles south of the Iranian coast was running its standard watch rotation as it had for the previous 11 days. The authorization had come 6 hours earlier, through a secure transmission from the National Command Authority to CENTCOM and INDOPACOM simultaneously. It had not been a response to a military strike. It had been a response to a laboratory result. 41 days prior, the International Atomic Energy Agency's monitoring team at the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, located 90 meters beneath a granite mountain in Qom province, hardened against conventional precision engagement, built precisely to survive the kind of strike now being planned, had recorded centrifuge cascade output consistent with uranium enrichment at 89.7% purity. Not 60%, the threshold the IAEA had been monitoring with escalating alarm for 18 months. Not 84%, the level that had triggered an Emergency Security Council session 26 days ago. 89.7%. Weapons grade was defined as 90%. The decimal point between 89.7 and 90.0 was the distance between a threshold and a crossing. The IAEA's formal notification to member states had arrived at national capitals within 4 hours. The U.S. President had been briefed at 2 a.m. Washington time. The Director of National Intelligence had assessed, with high confidence, that Iran's parallel weaponization research program, the technical work required to convert enriched material into a functioning device, was at a stage that could produce a first device within 7 to 11 months if the enrichment program continued uninterrupted. 7 months was not a diplomatic timeline. 7 months was a countdown. The decision that followed had required 3 weeks of deliberation across the NSC, intensive coordination with the Israeli government, and a legal review that consumed more working hours than any targeting package in the post-Cold War period. The conclusion of that deliberation was a finding that the combination of 89.7% enrichment and a sub-12-month weaponization timeline constituted a sufficient threshold to authorize military action under the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense. The finding was contested by 2 NSC members. It was authorized by the President. The operation was not designed to end Iran's nuclear program permanently. It was designed to set it back by a calculable number of years, while diplomatic and economic pressure was applied to foreclose reconstitution. The target list reflected that objective precisely. Every facility involved in the enrichment cycle, every known weaponization research node, every centrifuge production and storage site, and every engineering support infrastructure element that had been cataloged in 31 months of collection. The list had 94 aim points. It was the most technically complex precision engagement package the U.S. had ever assembled. The aircraft that would deliver the most critical portion of that package had been airborne for 9 hours before the authorization arrived. 2 B-2A Spirit stealth bombers had departed Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri at 4 p.m. Central Time the previous day under a standard long-range training mission flight plan that attracted no unusual attention. They had been joined by 2 additional B-2As from Diego Garcia that had been pre-positioned to the Indian Ocean base 6 days earlier under a separate logistics rotation cover. 4 B-2As in total, each carrying a load that no other aircraft in the world could replicate. 2 GBU-57A/B Massive Ordnance Penetrators, the 30,000-pound bunker-defeating weapon that the U.S. had developed specifically because no other available munition was assessed as having a reasonable probability of achieving structural defeat against targets at Fordow's depth. 8 GBU-57s total. 8 weapons for the 4 facilities that existing intelligence assessed as being beneath sufficient hardened overburden to require MOP-class penetration. Fordow, the deeply buried centrifuge production facility near Natanz, the underground weaponization research vault at Parchin, and the command and hardened storage complex beneath Isfahan's military district. At 1:14 a.m., the 4 B-2As crossed into Iranian airspace from the south, maintaining altitude above 50,000 feet. Their radar cross-sections reduced to values that made detection by Iran's long-range search radar network unlikely at altitude but not impossible at certain aspect angles over the Zagros mountain radar sites. The mission planning had identified 4 radar nodes along the penetration corridor whose coverage geometry created potential detection windows. Those nodes had been pre-assigned to AARGM-ER engagements by F/A-18F aircraft operating from the carrier, timed to arrive at the radar sites between 7 and 12 minutes before the B-2s transited their coverage sectors. The AARGM-ER strikes were the first kinetic events of the operation. At 1:07 a.m., 4 F/A-18Fs launched their AARGM-ER anti-radiation missiles from position 60 nautical miles off the Iranian coast. The missiles navigated at low altitude toward their assigned radar targets, homing on the active emissions of the S-300 PMU-2 search radars at Bandar Abbas, Isfahan, Arak, and Dezful. At 1:19 a.m., all 4 radar nodes went offline in a 5-second window. The B-2 penetration corridor had 4 gaps in it that had not been there at 1:18 a.m. The EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft orbiting at standoff range over the northern Gulf had been active since 1 a.m., suppressing the IRGC Air Defense Command's communication and data link frequencies. The suppression was not intended to be comprehensive. A comprehensive jamming signature over Iranian airspace would have announced that an operation was underway. The Growler's output was calibrated to create the electromagnetic signature of weather-related interference, degraded but not jammed, slow enough to generate uncertainty rather than alarm in the IRGC's command posts. The difference between a jamming event and atmospheric ducting was a matter of pattern analysis. The IRGC's signals intelligence operators would eventually identify the pattern. The B-2s needed 8 minutes of radar gap. The gap was 12 minutes long. At 1:22 a.m., the lead B-2 reached its initial point for the Fordow weapons release. Fordow was the hardest target on the list. The facility sat beneath 90 meters of granite, a depth that had been assessed as defeating all previous U.S. bunker-defeating munitions prior to the GBU-57's development. The GBU-57 had been specifically designed and tested against hardened targets at depth. Its design specification called for defeat of targets at 60 meters in reinforced concrete. Granite was denser than reinforced concrete. 90 meters of granite was not 60 meters of concrete. The engagement planners had modeled the MOP's performance against Fordow's specific overburden composition using data from the classified underground test program and had produced a probability assessment. A single GBU-57 impact at optimal aim point and approach angle had a 71% probability of achieving structural defeat of the primary centrifuge halls at depth. A second impact into the crater created by the first, fired from the same approach vector with a calculated time separation that allowed the first weapon's penetration channel to stabilize before the second weapon entered it, raised the combined probability to 94%. The lead B-2 was carrying 2 GBU-57s for Fordow, one for the primary aim point, one for the follow-through impact through the penetration channel. The approach geometry, the release altitude, the weapon's terminal velocity, and the fuse delay sequence had been calculated to place the second weapon in the channel created by the first with a 4.1 second separation. At the GBU-57's terminal velocity, 4.1 seconds was 47 meters of additional penetration before the first weapon's fuse sequence completed. The first GBU-57 released at 1:22 a.m. The second followed at 1:22 a.m., calculated to impact 4.1 seconds after the first. The aircraft continued on course, executing its post-release egress maneuver while the weapons guidance systems made terminal corrections. At 1:23 a.m., the first GBU-57 impacted the Fordow mountain surface at the primary aim point. The seismograph at the University of Tehran's Geophysics Monitoring Station registered the impact as a 2.1 magnitude geological event. 12 seconds later, the second GBU-57 impacted at the same point, entering the crater and penetration channel created by the first. The geophysics station registered a 2.6 magnitude event. The two events were separated by 12 seconds on the seismograph record. The combined penetration and detonation sequence had functioned within 0.3 seconds of the design specification. The structural integrity assessment of Fordow's primary centrifuge halls would require post-strike imagery and signals analysis over the following 72 hours. The immediate assessment, based on seismic signature analysis and the pre-mission modeling, high probability of structural defeat of the primary centrifuge halls. The secondary processing areas and the administrative infrastructure above the primary level, assessed as significantly damaged. The facility's electrical and ventilation infrastructure, assessed as non-functional. While the B-2 egressed south, the rest of the target list was being addressed by the weapons platforms that had been holding their positions since 1 a.m. From submarine launch positions in the Arabian Sea and the northern Indian Ocean, 89 Tomahawk cruise missiles had been in flight since 12:47 a.m., the longest range assets in the operation, assigned to the surface and near-surface target set that did not require MOP-class penetration. The Natanz Surface Enrichment Complex, above ground, received 12 Tomahawk impacts between 1:31 a.m. and 1:33 a.m. The fuel storage, electrical transformation infrastructure, the above-ground centrifuge assembly buildings, and the access road infrastructure whose repair would extend any reconstitution timeline by adding logistical complexity. The Arak heavy water research reactor's external infrastructure received 8 impacts. The Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center's surface facilities received 11. The above-ground facilities were not the primary objective. They were the visible layer of a program whose critical mass resided underground. But disrupting the surface infrastructure extended any reconstitution timeline by removing the support systems, power, logistics, personnel access, that the underground facilities required to operate even after repair. A centrifuge hall that survived 90 meters underground was still non-operational if its electrical grid, its cooling water infrastructure, and its personnel access tunnels had been rendered non-functional above ground. At 1:28 a.m., the B-1B Lancer aircraft operating from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which had been airborne since 11:30 p.m. the previous evening under a standard maritime patrol flight plan, received their execute signal and turned north. Each aircraft carried 12 JASSM-ER cruise missiles assigned to the IRGC's weaponization research facilities. The Parchin military complexes assessed underground research sections, the Lavizan 3-site east of Tehran that had been identified through environmental sampling as a probable high-explosive testing location, and 6 additional engineering support facilities distributed across Tehran Province and Semnan Province. The JASSM-ER releases began at 1:34 a.m. as the B-1Bs reached their release corridor over the southern Iranian plateau. The Parchin target required the second pair of B-2s carrying GBU-57s. The Parchin Underground Research Vault, assessed at 45 meters depth beneath reinforced concrete and compacted earth, shallower than Fordow but with a different overburden composition that had required separate penetration modeling, received its first GBU-57 at 1:29 a.m., 7 minutes ahead of the Fordow sequence because Parchin's shallower depth meant a shorter penetration time and the fuse delay sequence was calibrated differently. The second GBU-57 followed at 1:29 a.m. The seismograph at the Iranian Seismological Center logged 2 events, 2.3 and 2.4 magnitude, separated by 9 seconds. Post-mission assessment. High probability of structural defeat of the primary research vault. At 1:31 a.m., the third B-2A reached its release point for the Natanz deeply buried centrifuge production facility. A target distinct from the Natanz surface complex, located 80 meters below the facility's main access road and identified through ground-penetrating radar analysis of satellite imagery over a 28-month collection period. 2 GBU-57s. First impact at 1:32 a.m. Second impact 4.7 seconds later. Seismic events of 2.0 and 2.4 magnitude logged by the monitoring station at Kashan. The fourth B-2A was assigned the Isfahan Command and Hardened Storage Complex, the facility assessed as the primary custodial location for Iran's declared and undeclared enriched uranium stockpile above weapons-grade threshold. The facility's depth was assessed at 55 meters beneath reinforced concrete, consistent with the GBU-57's designed engagement envelope without the geological uncertainty that characterized Fordow. First GBU-57 at 1:35 a.m. Second at 1:36 a.m. Seismic events of 2.2 and 2.7 magnitude. By 1:36 a.m., all 8 GBU-57s had been released. All 4 B-2As were in their egress profiles, heading south at maximum altitude, their low observable characteristics providing the margin they needed to transit back through Iranian airspace before the IRGC's radar network could reconstitute from the AARGM-ER impacts. The IRGC Air Defense Command had been attempting to understand what was happening since 1:19 a.m., when 4 radar nodes went offline in 5 seconds. The offline signature was not consistent with equipment failure. Equipment failures were singular and staggered. 5 seconds across 4 nodes was an external event. The command post watch officer had issued an air defense alert at 1:20 a.m., 9 minutes after the Growler had begun its calibrated interference pattern, and 4 minutes after the AARGM-ER impacts. By 1:25 a.m., surviving S-300 batteries had been directed to active search on alternative frequencies. They acquired no aircraft signatures. The B-2s were above their optimum detection range and operating in aspect angles that minimized their radar return against the available search geometry. At 1:29 a.m., the IRGC's Seismic Monitoring Service transmitted an alert to the Air Defense Command. 2 geological events at Qum Province, coordinates consistent with Fordow. Not weather. Not equipment. The Air Defense Command watch officer understood what was happening at 1:29 a.m. He had 7 minutes of warning before the Natanz impacts and 12 minutes before the Isfahan sequence. Those minutes were not sufficient to alter the outcome of any engagement already in motion. They were sufficient to generate an urgent command communication to surviving S-400 and S-300 battery commanders, directing maximum search effort on all available frequencies. ITU, the F/A-18F crew assigned to SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, had been monitoring the IRGC's command frequency since 1 a.m. At 1:31 a.m., the crew detected the reconstitution command from the Air Defense Command to its surviving S-300 batteries. One S-300 battery in Isfahan province had survived the initial AARGM-ER strikes. It had been offline for scheduled maintenance at the time of the 1:19 a.m. engagement and had not been radiating, which meant the AARGM-ER had had no active emission to home on. It was now actively searching on its primary frequency, having received the reconstitution order. Its search geometry covered a sector of the southern Iranian plateau through which the third B-2 was currently aggressing. An AARGM-ER was released at 1:32 a.m. targeting the reactivated S-300's fire control radar. The S-300 operator detected the AARGM-ER launch warning from his own radar warning receiver at 1:33 a.m. and went to radar shutdown. a survivability protocol that turned off the emitting system to deny the anti-radiation missile its homing signal. The AARGM-ER, having memorized the emitter's last position before shutdown, continued on its stored heading and impacted within 40 meters of the radar trailer. The post-mission assessment was probable damage, not confirmed neutralization. The S-300 battery's operational status after the impact was unknown. It did not resume emission during the operation's active phase. At 1:39 a.m., the last JASSM-ER impacted its assigned target, the Lavizan 3 high-explosive testing infrastructure east of Tehran. By 1:39 a.m., the last Tomahawk had impacted its assigned aim point in the Arak external infrastructure sequence. The operation's kinetic phase had lasted 25 minutes from first AARGM-ER impact to last Tomahawk impact. 25 minutes in which 89 Tomahawk cruise missiles, 47 JASSM-ERs, 8 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, and 4 AARGM-ER anti-radiation missiles had addressed 94 aim points across 12 Iranian provinces. No U.S. aircraft had been engaged. No U.S. personnel had been in the target area. The operation had been conducted entirely with standoff and penetrating munitions, from platforms that the IRGC's air defense network had not successfully tracked or engaged. The F/A-18F crew on CD duty, orbiting at standoff range, logged the last radar emission from inside Iran at 1:41 a.m. A single S-300 search radar, briefly active, then offline again. The crew held their position for another 22 minutes before receiving the stand-down transmission. They had not released a second AARGM-ER. The single radar event had not been sustained long enough to confirm a lock-on against a protected asset. The rules of engagement required confirmed lock-on before a second strike. There was no second strike. The pilot transmitted his status: SEAD complete, Winchester -2, RTB. He had one AARGM-ER remaining. He turned south. The political reaction began before the last Tomahawk impacted. Iran's UN mission was notified by its foreign ministry at 1:28 a.m. that a military action was underway, and was directed to request an Emergency Security Council session. The request was transmitted at 1:41 a.m., 2 minutes after the last Kinetic event. The Security Council session convened at 6 a.m. New York time. The U.S. Permanent Representative presented the legal finding of anticipatory self-defense under Article 51. The Russian and Chinese delegations presented resolutions condemning the action. The U.S. vetoed both. The British and French delegations abstained on the resolutions. The session ended without a binding resolution. This outcome had been projected with 94% confidence in the NSC deliberation 3 weeks earlier. The IAEA's monitoring team at Natanz, which had been evacuated to the facility's administrative building at surface level at 1:15 a.m. following a U.S. notification through the Vienna back channel, reported no personnel losses. Their monitoring equipment at the surface complex was non-functional. Their ability to access the underground sections was suspended pending structural assessment. The damage assessment process for the 4 GBU-57 aim points would require satellite imagery, signals intelligence collection, and seismic analysis over a minimum of 72 hours before confident conclusions could be drawn. What the immediate assessment could state: all 4 seismic sequences were consistent with the design specification for the GBU-57 double-tap engagement. None of the 4 targets had resumed electronic activity consistent with operational status in the 40 minutes since impact. Post-strike reconnaissance aircraft operating from Diego Garcia had been tasked to collect imagery at first light, approximately 4 hours from now. Total munitions expended: 8 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 89 Tomahawk cruise missiles, 47 JASSM-ER, for AARGM-ER. Total munitions cost approximately $920 million. Estimated value of Iranian nuclear infrastructure addressed $18.6 billion in accumulated program investment over 23 years. No U.S. aircraft were lost. No U.S. personnel were in the target area. No U.S. personnel were injured. The U.S. had conducted a strike operation against 94 military and program-specific installations across a sovereign nation's territory without losing a single platform or personnel asset. The operational conduct had been as close to its design specification as any operation the U.S. military had conducted in the precision era. The question that the damage assessment process would answer over the following 72 hours was whether the combination of GBU-57 double-tap sequences and Tomahawk surface infrastructure engagement had achieved the program objective. A setback of 5 to 8 years to Iran's nuclear weapons development timeline, sufficient to create the space for a negotiated framework that foreclosed reconstitution. The assessment of that question would not be made in this building, on this watch, at this hour. The weapons had done what weapons could do. The rest was a different kind of operation, conducted in different rooms, by different people, with different instruments. The B-2A lead aircraft crossed the Iranian coast outbound at 1:44 a.m. and entered international airspace over the Gulf of Oman. Its fuel state was within parameters for direct return to Diego Garcia. The aircraft commander logged the coast-out time and trimmed the autopilot for the long transit south. He had been airborne for 14 hours. He would be airborne for 6 more. He turned off the tactical display and looked at the darkness outside the cockpit for a moment. Then he turned it back on. There was nothing to see in the darkness. The display had information. He flew south.